Victor Davis Hanson, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So our ambition in this conversation is to look back over the course of that period in between Operation Rising Lion and Operation Midnight Thunder, and all that we've learned since. And just, I'd like to, I suppose, begin by asking the largest question, and then we can go into some detail. But as you think about this from the perspective of American interests, what did we learn about President Trump's willingness to undertake this strike?
Well, I think they learned the world learned two things: that he is unpredictable, maybe even volatile, and that's a good thing as far as America is concerned, and maybe unfortunate thing for its enemies. But more importantly, he's not rash as people have accused him, because he couples even preemptive action with almost immediate opportunities for ceasefire. So he always gives the intended target an out. And he did it in this case with Iran. He's done it in the past in his first term with the killing of Soleimani. And I think that allows him to use force. More importantly, he measures it in a cost to benefit analysis of what is good for what he considers solely American interest. And if it's on the plus side of the ledger, he's willing to do that. And that almost certainly precludes the use of ground troops or military engagements for more than, I don't know, a few weeks that would interrupt his domestic agenda or the Abraham's Accord or alienate his mega base.
And if you had to make the case, we've heard a great many analysts and commentators advance the view that actually a nuclear Iran does not uniquely threaten the United States, and therefore the destruction of Iran's nuclear capabilities is not squarely in American interest. If you had to answer that argument, what would you say?
Well, it's always a cost to benefit analysis. So supposedly we did not take commiserate action against North Korea because it had a nuclear patron right next door, China. And we felt that the risk outweighed the obvious advantages, or we would have done it. It was discussed in the George W. Bush administration. But in this case, I think there was an assessment made that you could, at this particular opportune time, neuter this Iranian nuclear project, which would be in our interest because it was much closer than people had anticipated. It could be successful, and more importantly, it could set a precedent that you could do it. If you were successful, you could do it almost any time you wished. I've never seen a military conflict in which a third party was so predominant. By that I mean, when America flew the B-2s in, it had to ask Israel for permission to go into Iranian airspace, which was kind of an illustration that there was no, I guess, no Iranian forces, no deterrent, no defense to speak of.
And actually, if you just think about what you just said, I think the logical implication of that is that the actions that Israel undertook in Operation Rising Lion is a precondition or is an asset to the exercise of American power, that actually Israel's actions against Iran also would serve America's interests.
Yeah, I might even go further and say that it would have been impossible for, politically impossible for Trump to make that decision unless six or seven things had happened. And they were all attributable to the post-October 7th events that Israel looked at and then acted upon. And one of them, of course, was the Israeli last year and this year destruction of Iran's air defenses. Another was the weakening of Hezbollah, which in turn meant that Hezbollah would not be unleashed against American targets in the Middle East, Syria, and Iraq. That even more importantly, that weakening of Hezbollah led to the weakening of the Assad dynasty, and then that led to the flight, almost in Kabul fashion, of Russia out of Syria. So when you factor in the Houthis had been neutered by earlier, that was easier for, we did a lot of it, but it was easier for us that Israel had done a lot as well, and then Hamas. So when you looked at the bigger picture, when Trump wanted to make that decision, it was simply, well, Russia's not a player anymore in the Middle East. There's a new government in Syria. This government in Syria represents 75% of the actual demography of Syria, which was Arab and Sunni. It's no longer a supply depot for Iran, and that means the Israelis, should they choose to strike, can use Syrian airspace. And then in addition, Hezbollah is not going to be unleashed against American targets. Hamas is not. The Houthis are not. So it was all kind of served up on a platter for the United States, which I couldn't quite understand, that a lot of people on the right said that we were acting unilaterally, preemptively on the bequest of Bibi Netanyahu, because actually it was in our interest to nullify that threat, but we wouldn't have been able to do it if those events that I just outlined had not occurred. And they all occurred on unilaterally by Israel at sometimes great cost and danger to it.
And it strikes me as an expression of an entirely new, you could say new old, but a new conception, new relative to the last several administrations of American foreign policy, but a new conception of the strategic management of alliances, in which the United States is able to, at relatively little cost to itself, empower allies who undertake their own efforts, who undertake with their own soldiers and their own arms missions that serve American interests on our behalf.
I think it has had that effect. I think it's had a profound effect on Europe. So the subsequent NATO alliance summit was very different than the 2017. Just to take one example, the first administration, they were calling Trump, the supreme NATO leader was calling him daddy, but more importantly, there was no opposition except for Spain to the idea that Europe would, eventually try to get 5% of GDP investment in defense, that Germany would have the biggest land army they promised in Europe. Poland has already spent almost over 4% GDP. There was no criticism. It was almost a triumphant presence or intercession by Trump, and that's because I think they saw that they had played a two-sided, two-faced, I should say, attitude toward Iran. They were deathly afraid of that nuclear program, and coupled with ballistic missiles that put them in greater danger than even us, because they were so more proximate. And more importantly, it was up against their idea of preemptive action. So they wanted it out, but they couldn't do it themselves, and they wanted the United States to do it, or Israel, and they wanted to be able to criticize that. And I think with Trump, they realized that they could not criticize him, or he wouldn't stand for it. So then they decided, well, just as Israel had been empowered, and there were no threats to cut off munitions as Biden had done, there was no daylight anymore between Israel. Maybe a closer relationship with the United States, now that we have somebody who's not afraid to protect its interest, and those interests include NATO. Maybe we should move closer to the United States, because it's sounding a different tune now. It's confident, and with the Ukrainian mess right next door, we get the impression that the United States has got a greater deterrent ability to stop Putin's aggression. And so it had a lot of ripples effect, and that's not the only one. It also warned China. I think I wrote about that everybody had said China's might intervene. Well, China just basically came over and said, keep the Straits of Hormuz open. That's it. We get 50% of our oil from the Middle East. Do not close the strait. Putin was asked, are you going to replace the Iranian anti-aircraft missile? And his basic attitude was no. And the subtext was, why would I do it again when you would lose it? And I've got enough problems with Ukraine without getting mired in Iran with you people. And you're losers. You lost. You're like the Assads. You're an embarrassment. So I don't want any part of you. Basically, they had China. That was kind of striking, because we heard from the right here in America that it would be World War III, 30,000 casualties, a forever war. And that could only happen if China and Russia had intervened. We were warned that the BRICS new alliance would be deadly for us. But it turned out that in some weird, perverse way, after Iran was humiliated, its subordinates and its allies hated it as much as we hated it. I mean, Hamas and And the Houthis and Hezbollah were all crippled, but they didn't try to do anything to help Iran. I think their attitude was, well, when we were attacking Israel simultaneously or individually, you just sat back and watched us and we were expendable, useful idiots as far as you were concerned. So we're not going to do anything for you either. We're not going to try to attack Israel because we know what will happen to us if we do. It's the whole thing has been recalibrated, and we don't appreciate that because of this kind of pseudo crisis that there might be some enriched uranium still left. But if there is, the problem with Iran from going on forward is not whether there is enriched uranium somewhere. It's not whether they can rebuild it. It's whether there will be an administration in the United States and in Israel when it has actionable intelligence, it will act to send the message that they cannot enrich uranium. And that's all, and because they have the ability. They didn't have the ability, that premise wouldn't be true. But they both have demonstrable ability at this point to go into Iran at will and stop this, or at least delay it. And as long as that's true, in a cost to benefit analysis, it's much cheaper to bomb something into uselessness than it is to build it. And but it is predicated on the type of government both in the United States and Israel.
Look, I think it's a mistake for offering up a first cut of history to put too much weight on any one particular given action or event. Nevertheless, there are events, you've written books about them. There are significant battles that do change the course of nations. And I don't know if this is such a battle or not. Time will tell. But I do think that it's a useful comparison to say, how did the United States, how did the Trump administration understand its own strategic position, its need to deter the threats that it saw itself up against, say, in May 2025? And how does it understand those things now after the strike, going into July 2025? Meaning, how did this change the way that the Americans understand themselves and their own position vis-a-vis this anti-American alliance that you just described?
Well, things had changed at the United from Trump's first term. When he looked at this alliance, he saw two things immediately. Number one is that Russia's probably suffered 1 million casualties, probably 1.5 million on both sides, dead, wounded, and missing in Ukraine, and its munitions have been depleted. It may eventually grind down the Ukrainians, but it was not going to intervene anywhere else, and nor could it. And China was locked into an existential trade war with the United States. And Trump pretty much was accurate when he said those who suffered large deficits, $300 billion deficits, are in a much better position in negotiations than those that pile them up. And he said again and again, contrary to the Wall Street Journal, he kept saying, China is making so much money and they have such a great profit, they will be willing to cut their profit margin somewhat, and that won't raise inflation, to pay our tariffs and to reduce their surpluses somewhat to get continued access to our markets. And if they don't believe that, we have a lot of other levers, like 300,000 Chinese students here that are basically appropriating technology. It's all of that. So my point is that he saw that China and Russia were in a much less powerful position to injure us should we act preemptively anywhere. Then he looked again at Israel and he said, this is not the Israel prior to October 7th that was kind of naive about Hamas, that the October 7th came in, that had the big massive demonstrations in the street. Netanyahu was out of power for a while. This is an Israel that over the last 2 years did things that people could not believe. And so they have altered the landscape of the Middle East, and Russia and China are not the powers that they are. And then they had always looked at Iran very differently than Obama and Biden, but also differently than George W. Bush. When they were killing 600 officially, but maybe 2,000 through shape charges in Iraq, Bush just didn't want to go to the next level with Iran. And there had become a mystique about Iran that's very, very powerful. It's got 90 million people. It's 10 times the size, 20 times, 30 times the size of Israel. It's just, you don't want to go near there. The Persian Shia are a different type of Islamic radicalism. They're not even coherent. They're not rational. They blow up Marines in Lebanon. They blow up our embassy. They torture us. You just don't want to touch that. But when you actually, when Trump, when he took out Soleimani, he actually was asking people, is there any credibility to this fearsome reputation? And the only real conventional example was the 80-88 war, in which, Iraq had about 40% of the population and fought it to a standstill for 8 years and forced Khomeini to sue for peace. So I think Trump thought before the Israeli attrition of Iran, but even more so afterwards, that Iran was not a formidable power, contrary to everything that we read about in the United States. There was just something in the last 50 years about these goose-stepping Nazi-like soldiers, the screaming death to America, that had a profound impression on Westerners. But it was never calibrated on actual reality of military competency or efficacy. And the Israelis knew that. They were not afraid to attack them, and they understood that they were, that their Air Force was just, they weren't even comparable. And so,
Meanwhile, the perception of the United States in the in the capitals of these many powers also was a United States that had retreated from Afghanistan in a very damaging way, that had made it a central tenet of its foreign policy to accommodate and fund Iran in a variety of ways. You know, it had tried to be preemptively nice to a lot of different nations. And I think that to a significant extent, Operation Midnight Hammer also put an end to that kind of fuzzy misconception of the willingness of the Americans to deploy force.
yeah, I think all of the major players, or I should say the antagonist in this theater, had gotten the mistaken impression from the Biden administration that the United States was weak and it couldn't act. And there was some evidence that for that supposition, as misguided ultimately as it proved. The Chinese, for example, they had humiliated our diplomats in Anchorage right at the beginning of the Biden. They had allowed they had allowed a spy balloon to go with impunity across the continental United States. They were buying farmland over the objection of people in Congress in proximity to bases, and we did nothing. They were running up these huge trade deficits. They were known 2 or 3% of the 300,000 students were engaged in espionage. Everybody knew that. We had a PLA person on the faculty at Stanford. Nobody acted on it, and China took that not as magnanimity to be reciprocated, but as weakness to be exploited. And then when you looked at the Arab Middle East, counterintuitively, the Gulf sheikdoms in Jordan and Egypt, they looked at this and they said well, if the Biden administration is having daylight between Israel and it's reacting to domestic pressure, why would we want to get on the Abraham's Accord when they're kind of distancing themselves from Israel and they're reacting to pro-Hamas demonstrations in their own party base that are more pro-Palestinian than we are? And the Gulf Sheikdom said, we're looking right across the Gulf at Iran, and this Biden administration is giving them money, lifting them sanctions. So we're all going to make the necessary adjustments. And the necessary adjustments are the United States either can't or won't do anything to protect its allies or advance its interest. And then when they looked at Russia, they said to themselves, you mentioned the disgraceful, humiliating flight from Kabul, but they had remembered Biden had said, well, our action will be predicated on whether it's a minor invasion or not. He had asked Putin not to hit particular cyber targets if they were humanitarian in nature, hospitals, not to stop it. In other words, he didn't say stop it. He said, if you're going to do this, basically don't hit hospitals or humanitarian entities. So you added all that up. There were other things in the military. They were astute students of what Lloyd Austin and Mark Milley were saying. I mean, when you have the chairman of the Joint Chiefs calling his Chinese counterpart up and warning him that his own commander in chief may be on hinge, and if that is so, he would warn the Chinese in any existential crisis ahead of time that we might go to DEFCON 1 or 2. And then you also had their crazy critical race theory dalliances before Congress where they said we're going to white privilege, white supremacy, white rage. We were down 45,000 recruits that would not join the military. And the DI was in commercials on television. So in their way of thinking, the U.S. military humiliated in Afghanistan, fraught with recruitment shortments, and turning into a social justice network has lost its edge. And that is reified by its diplomatic cautiousness and appeasement because it doesn't feel that its military could back up any diplomatic initiative. And that was and it was added to it by the dementia of Joe Biden, and not just the dementia, but the empty bombast. What would you say to Putin? Don't. He would say things like that, and it was completely empty. And so it was a force multiplier. I think a lot of us were very worried in 2024, 23 that things were spiraling out of control and somebody was going to do something stupid, whether that was invasion of Taiwan or Iran preempting against Israel. And it was a very dangerous time.
And you can imagine that troop morale, in American armed forces would have reflected that uncertainty. The reconceptualization of the purpose of the American military to serve those social ends that the president's party had put at the center of their agenda. It turns out that the exercise of the American power is a way to restore, because it gives a purpose and dignity and reminds the troops in service that they can do things.
Yes, and that was sorely needed after Afghanistan. And Trump is very astute in his own way. He wanted to restore global and domestic confidence in the military, but the one way not to do it would have like a Carter rescue mission or a commando raid. These are a fraud. And he had noticed that the last day in office that Obama was president, for all of the Democrats talk about the War Powers Act, he bombed pretty much 26,000 bombs he dropped in 2016. But the point I'm making is that he ordered the same B-2s on a long mission of 5,000 miles to bomb a Libyan terrorist camp successfully, and they came back. And Trump realized that if you're going to use U.S. power uh, and you're going to intimidate the enemy and actually in real terms hurt it, the best thing that you can do is air power. We kind of discounted that in the past because we were reacting against the Bill Clinton missiles to kill a camel and all that rhetoric. And we've got to get on the ground because we were going to nation build and change the very calculus of these countries so that we were going to the root causes. Well, that didn't work out, again, in a cost-benefit analysis. So Trump said, what is our forte? And what are the least chances it can go wrong? And what are the most impressive uses of it? And so when you have these huge bombers with 170-foot wingspan and they go all across, halfway across the world, and they drop these huge bombs that no one else has into something about the size of a dryer or a washer, it's very impressive. And they do it without they do it without killing very many people, probably, and they didn't lose anybody. So all of these are talking points for Trump, and the world reacted accordingly. Because when he said no one could do this, people said, well, that's just Trump. Their first impression, that's just Trump talking. Their second impression is, do we have a bomber like that could fly that way? Do we have bombs of that caliber? Do we have a person that would take such chances? And the answer was no, no, no. So it was quite impressive.
I want to now go to assessing the same thing. We just said, okay, how does America understand itself and the consequences of this action? Compare May 2025 to, July 2025. I want to do the same exercise now and try to understand from Russia's point of view on the one hand and from China's point of view on the other hand, what the humiliation of the Iranian regime and the neutralization of Iranian nuclear capacity means for China, means for Russia.
It it means that the United States now is very selective in its allies and subordinates, and they're very accomplished. So they look at Israel and they can't quite calibrate how a country of 9.5 million people is dominating the entire region and dominated in every type of conventional, non-conventional terrorist aspects, especially its intelligence. The idea that anybody in Hamas or Hezbollah or in the Iranian nuclear physics community or the command and control would come up and privately say, I'm going to destroy Israel, that's synonymous with them getting killed. And they know that. And no other country can do that. So the United States has an ally like that. Even when they look at Ukraine, they say, for all of the MAGA disputes about Ukraine, here's a country with 40 million people. It has 1/4 the population, 1/10 the GDP, 1/30th the area, and it's held off this juggernaut. And we're supplying it. And Trump is starting to see that now, that if he cuts it off, it's like a Kabul. But if he keeps funding it, maybe he'll have the leverage to get a ceasefire. Then they look at NATO. And they said, the NATO acquisitions that Trump had been pushing and supported, it's not Latvia. It's the greatest artillery force in Europe, the Finns, and it's Sweden with probably the most sophisticated arms industry, especially fighter aircraft. So these are real assets that are coming into NATO while it bolsters its military expenditures. It's got in the Middle East an ally fighting for its life that wants to fight and will be successful, Israel. It's got another one with Russia in Ukraine, and people are saying in Asia that had doubt under the Biden. I'm talking about South Korea, Japan, Australia, the Philippines. They're saying, we feel a lot more secure as long as we understand that Trump helps those who helps themselves. So he's a blunderbuss when he berates people that don't like. They're watching what he says to Canada. Well, he's screaming and yelling at Canada because they spend 1.37 on GDP. But if you were to spend what Trump wanted and you were to be pro-American, then he will be reciprocal and he will help his allies. He helps those who help themselves. And the result of that on China and Russia, I think right now they're in a holding pattern. Both of them are. They're kind of mystified in a very strange way. If we had this conversation a year ago, and I said, or you said, I predict in a year Russia will be out of Syria. It will not. That invitation that Kerry and Obama had offered to come back 15 years, it's over with. They're gone. They're not. They have no voice in the Middle East. No one would have believed you.
It also, I suppose, gives a kind of template or example for those other nations, for the Philippines, for Japan, for South Korea, for Ukraine, to say, if we pattern ourselves and show the same sort of determination and fight as Israel was able to show, then we too could have this sort of alliance relationship with the United States. From America's perspective, there's almost something, like the grand strategy of the Roman Empire
Yeah.
deployed these kind of allies in precisely this kind of way.
Yeah. You can really see it in Eastern Europe that Poland is Poland is Poland and Hungary are creating, punching way above their weight, and they're on the front line. And it also gives a message to the soft power countries, the people like the French or the British or who had opposed us. They're starting to get the message as well that we don't want to be left out by this. I could not believe that Macron and Sturmer were kind of pushing people out of the way to talk to Trump at the NATO. And their message was, well, don't forget us. We're going to rearm too. We're going to be defenders. They don't mock. It's no longer the United States are stupid Roman legionaries and we're Greek philosophers. They don't have that attitude anymore. And it's funny. The only thing, again, that I'm worried about is two things. One is you have to, in a democratic society, you have such cyclical changes. The Israelis they have no margin of error because they're a garrison state. So if they get into a big fight about the judicial processes of reform, or they get a left-wing pacifist government, they're going to be in big trouble. And if we were to go back to the Biden-Obama paradigm, we would be in big trouble. The other thing is overconfidence. I think everybody thought after the Six-Day War you would never have the Yom Kippur surprise. Not that Yom Kippur wasn't eventual, it was an eventual victory, but that first 3 days were a symptom of Israeli overconfidence. And the same thing about October 7th. When I would go to Israel and talk to people prior to October 7th, I would say things like, I cannot believe Haifa. This looks like San Francisco in 1970. It's beautiful. It's booming. You'd look at the sky of Tel Aviv or Haifa, there were cranes everywhere. The whole
Right.
country had transformed. And you would talk to Israelis about it, and they'd say, well, our only problem is Hamas, but we're dealing with Hamas. They represent the true Palestinian resistance. The West Bank, the Palestinian Authority, we can get along with them. They're just soft, kind of bureaucrat, aging geriatrics. Hamas, but we have compromised them. We've got 20,000 people coming in from Gaza to work. We take them when they stub their toe. We take them to the ER. We've just nullified them. They don't know what to do. And all that time they were saying that, they were planning to kill as many Jews as possible and maybe even get all the way into Jerusalem. Who knows?
Right. Right.
And that was all because of overconfidence, which was justified on how successful and the miraculous economic transformation cultural of Israel. But you've got to be very careful about that in a Western society, because you always have these latent forces of appeasement or relaxation. It's a symptom of the ability of market capitalism and consensual government to create affluent, leisured citizens. And so it's constant refrain. You've got to keep up your vigilance.
Vigilance is clearly one of the vulnerabilities, potential vulnerabilities of democratic rule.
Yeah.
There's another, which you've already alluded to, which is because of the tempo and cadence of American politics. Right now, there's President Trump, but just a couple of years ago, we had President Biden. And just a couple of years from now, there will be a new president. And that president could come from a left-wing persuasion or a right-wing persuasion that are both united in their opposition to the deployment of American force abroad. And that's one of the great problems for strategic planning in a democratic government.
Yeah, it
It seems
is.
to me, that the very fact of this example shows us that we can do something, and it shows the consequences that are very salutary for our own strategic position in the world. But that might not be enough. Democratic peoples don't remember history either.
Yeah. And it's they when you have that hypercriticism of the current left, the international and the American left, then it makes you have no margin of error. So let's say that he had ordered these billion-dollar bombers to come, and there was a mix-up on refueling, and two had collided, and that could have happened very easily, and they had been destroyed, and the mission had been called off, sort of analogous to what Jimmy Carter happened in April of 1980 with a helicopter. Or let's say they got into airspace and they hadn't seen a battery, and the Iranians got a lucky shot and took down a $2 billion. It would have been catastrophic because there's no margin of error. But what Trump was trying to do by the use of the methodology he used to take out these three enrichment sites, I think, was to lower the possibility that it could go wrong and to play to our strength. And our strength, to be frank, is not to put ground troops in any of these countries, not just because we're fighting a unconventional war to their advantage, but in a cost to benefit, to use that term again, it's very hard to tell the American people that these people are worth it. To have people get killed, I want to be crass now. When you see people trying to help a nation like Iraq or Afghanistan, and then you see the nature of that nation, the American heartland said, I don't really care what's going on. I don't want to have my grandson die for those people. They're ingrates, and they have a system contrary to ours, and they always will. I'm not agreeing with that, but that's the reality in the Middle East. The other thing, it's very hard for the United States to send billion-dollar frigates or $14 billion carriers and park them off a coast in the age of drones and cheap drones and cheap rockets, and then have to spend $2 million on I mean, that little exchange with the Houthis cost us $1 billion. And we got at one point, I think, 4 or 5 minutes from losing a frigate if we didn't see one coming in. That's the type of warfare we don't want to get in. It'd be much better to either send missiles from land bases or bomb it from a land base. But we've got to be very careful that when we do use force, given the nature of criticism in the United States, that it has to have a very high chance of succeeding without being too timid and being, restrained by that reality. But I think sometimes, and the subtext of everything was Iraq, 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 Iraq. That was what we were told. All of the memes that people on the right and left used about the bombing before it happened was
Mm-hmm.
30,000 casualty, World War III, it's going to be another Iraq, it's going to be like Afghanistan. And when you try to talk to these people, even afterwards, you say we were in their airspace for 25 minutes. 25 minutes. It's not a forever war, 25 minutes. And they'll say, well, that's just the beginning. And you say, okay, we're going to do it twice. That's 50 minutes. And well, how do you know that they won't be better? Well, you don't, but somebody can take them out. I mean, the United States Air Force is as good as the Israeli Air Force, so they can do it too if they have to. So, uh, it's just the other thing that just I don't think with the demise of Saddam and Arab nationalism and ISIS and Islamic terrorists, not that they're gone, but when you look at all of those installations in the Middle East that we have in Syria and in the Gulf, they all are there for one purpose, really, and that was Iran. And that was the justification for them. And so it tells you it's a symptom of how much investment we were making to deter Iran. And Donald Trump's attack for 25 minutes was more successful than all the presence of those very vulnerable bases everywhere. And I think especially in Syria today, he announced he was lifting sanctions. I think you'll see that he is going, to your point about Roman client states, he's going to try to outsource to the new Syrian government a lot of the anti-Iranian, and they are anti-Iranian, and they're going to be working with the Israelis. But if he lifts sanctions, then I think he feels there's going to be less need to have these exposed bases in Syria, and maybe the same, and that will have an effect on Iraq as well, to have a country right next to them in Syria that is anti-Iranian. And
the American experience of the global war on terror, it is for good reason that has been the dominant construct that contours our thinking since, after all, so many Americans did serve and lose their lives in that set of conflicts. Nevertheless, you're right that it may be that we've overlearned or mislearned the lessons of that era and applied them here in undertaking Operation Midnight Thunder. President Trump has shown us a different way to engage in the exercise of American power. As you say, one without the same kind of commitment for on-the-ground engagement by American ground troops.
yeah, he has a very different reading on human nature. You saw it with the open border when he was told that if he came in and secured the border and started to deport, he would lose the Hispanic vote. Well, the Hispanic vote in the last election was roughly 50-50, and a recent poll at Rasmussen said he had 53% because he was trying to tell people that if you let illegal aliens in, they go to Hispanic communities, they swamp social services, they have gang members, and it's in their interest. And the same thing about Iran, he was trying to say, if you go on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan, and you have a gender studies program at the University of Kabul, or you fly the pride flag, and you try to be very Western and liberal, or you're going to build parks, new electric plant. I was embedded twice in Iraq, and I was very impressed by the goodwill of Americans. But when they were telling me they were building a new phone system or something like this, they being the occupied country doesn't look at that necessarily as magnanimous. But
Mm-hmm.
what they do, according to Trump's logic, if you don't high five it and you're quiet about it and you use overwhelming force and you're successful, they respect you. And then if you don't try to rub their noses in it, and that's what's weird about it. It's right out of Art of the Deal. When I wrote the first Trump book, I read all of those. And one of his formulas was you go in and you have these high expectations that are unrealistic. Then you act crazy, you scream, you yell, you get down to 55%. You take the person, you make the deal, but you never, ever criticize the person that negotiated with him. You praise them, how brilliant they were. So no sooner had Trump done this, uh, and then he allowed them this performance art celebrity ceremony, whatever you want to call it, attack on our base. And then
Mm-hmm.
he had a ceasefire. And then he even said, I could not believe it. He said, God bless America, God bless Israel, God bless Iran. He said that at a different point at one point. And he was saying, we hope to let's make Iran great again.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he didn't mean it literally, but what he was trying to say is they are totally humiliated right now. And I'm going to, at least rhetorically, not rub their snout in the dirt. And that will allow me not to seem as, uh, I don't know, war hungry, militaristic, mean. And that's what he did. Same thing with Soleimani. They called him up and said, we're going to have a performance art attack. He said, okay, you kill one American, you're in trouble.
Right.
And that's it. I don't know of a prior president. It's very hard for the enemy or the opponents to figure him out because he also uses force, but he's the only president that I've ever heard, the only political figure that I've ever heard talk of Ukraine in terms of the human cost. He always says that. This is crazy. We're killing all these young people. We're just wasting lives. I don't know if it's because he's a builder and he wants to build things and tearing them down doesn't make sense, or he's a humanitarian, but he said the same thing about Soleimani, and he said the same thing about this. We don't want to kill all these Iranians. Why would I want to reply and kill all these people? I don't want to kill people. When you have somebody that talks like that and then and to be frank, can kill people, not that he's a hypocrite, but they feel that no matter that it's not going to be an endless fight necessarily, that he's willing, if you're willing to make concessions, he's willing to listen. And the left have read him really wrong. They think he's sort of a cowboy braggadocio because they listen to some of the rhetoric, but it's got the weirdest refinement between the use of force and giving a humiliated enemy an out, a rhetorical out or psychological out, so you don't get bogged down in tit for tat, endless stuff like the no-fly zones in Iraq or the tanker war and all that stuff. He's got a way of doing that, but it does require the use of force, overwhelming force, and it has to be successful.
This conversation was recorded on June 30th, 2025. Victor Davis Hanson, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.